Greetings, friends, and happy MLK Day. MLK Day is probably my favorite holiday, as so many American holidays are really tied up with either Christianity or patriotism, neither of which I enjoy participating in. So today is really the perfect day to reflect upon leadership, and in particular, MLK's leadership and what makes him such an inspiring figure even up to today. And so MLK celebrations, they tend to talk about the end of King's life and his big speeches and accomplishments. But what about his early years when he was just starting out as a leader? So what sort of struggles might he have faced and overcome in order to step into his greatness as the conscience of an entire nation? So I just wanted to talk for a few minutes about, what makes MLK special as a leader, what kind of fears and personal insecurities might he have faced, and what we can learn from him regarding the insecurities and fears that we might have about speaking out as gender creative leaders. So first of all, with regards to personal insecurities, MLK was extremely young. He was only about 25 when he was called into his life mission. And he met with presidents in the White House, and he flew to India and met with Gandhi. And, all of that must have been pretty intimidating for somebody who was so young. Bayard Rustin, who was the African-American gay man who organized the March on Washington, where King spoke his I Have a Dream speech, he actually had much more experience with nonviolent resistance than King did. And so there must have been some inner questioning, I could imagine, that MLK would have had of, why me? When there were clearly so many other really very talented people who in many ways were actually more qualified than he was. The second thing that strikes me is that he was also rather short. So he was only 5'6", which, for a man is pretty short stature, especially for somebody who became a national leader. And it must have lended, some extra significance to some of the physical assaults that he was subject to and his level of feeling safe in the world. And then finally, the other thing that strikes me is that, he was a junior. And so his father was Martin Luther King Sr. And his father, from everything that I have heard and read, was quite a powerful and dominant man. He wielded great influence in the Black community as a pastor, as well as a community leader. And he was somewhat feared by both Blacks and whites. Apparently, he was quite frank in his manner of speaking, and that people found it to be quite cutting at times. And so, also, while MLK was only 5'6", his father had quite a commanding presence. He was a large man, and he had a very dynamic personality that commanded a lot of attention. And he was very strong and self-confident. And even as a child, then his father was quite bold and stood up to whites. There's a story of him confronting the plantation owner where his father worked when the plantation owner was attempting to cheat his own father out of the wages that he was due. And so even as a child, then he stood up to whites. And as an adult, then his father was also the president of the NAACP in Atlanta. And so King was very reliant on his father. One of the quotes I thought was really interesting that he wrote in one of his books. He says, "The first 25 years of my life were very comfortable years. If I had a problem, I could always call Daddy. Things were solved. Life had been wrapped up for me in a Christmas package." And so it's very interesting to look at his relationship with his father and the ways that he felt somewhat dependent on his father and maybe a little overshadowed by his father. And so while he clearly admired his father and saw him as a role model, both in his community involvement as well as in his deep and strong moral conviction. His father's example must have also put a fair amount of pressure on him. And so MLK Jr. Did follow in his father's footsteps and actually became the assistant pastor to his father at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And so, clearly there's some part of him that must have had some kind of father issues of really wanting to live up to his father's reputation and to be able to make his father proud. And so those are some of his likely insecurities that he had to grapple with in stepping into his power of leadership. And so how about his fears? Because clearly, this was a man who could not have felt very safe in life. So for those of us who are called into leadership, then his example can actually represent some of our own worst nightmares about what might happen to us when we step out and share what we know. And so, some of these things, MLK was arrested over 20 times. He often received threatening phone calls, often late at night. His house was bombed and set on fire. He was regularly slandered in his reputation. So J. Edgar Hoover called him the most notorious liar in the country. This is very similar to the trajectory of Nelson Mandela, who for most of his life was called a terrorist, both in his own country as well as somewhat globally. While at a book signing for his new book, then MLK was stabbed and had to be rushed to Harlem Hospital, where a team of doctors successfully removed a 7-inch letter opener from his chest. That's pretty intense when you just think you're going to your book signing. When he was at a conference during the closing session of the Southern Leadership Conference in Birmingham, then a member of the American Nazi Party approached him and assaulted him, striking him twice in the face. Also, would be a little bit shocking when you're at a conference. And, burning crosses on his lawn were pretty common, and I can imagine pretty intimidating. And of course, ultimately, he was assassinated, which is the fate of most prophets in human history. And so, being here from the future myself, I've long felt myself to be something of a prophet, really bringing messages that most people simply do not want to hear, and that can be pretty intimidating, stepping out, knowing what happens to people who tend to bring those messages. And so one of the biggest obstacles for me in my own path of leadership has really been about overcoming those fears about what would happen to me if I stepped out. And I really felt a very visceral fear in my body for my own safety in this regard, about that I would be harmed for speaking out, even though I knew that, rationally speaking, this was probably very ungrounded. I don't know a whole lot about my past lives, but I did have a past life reading when I moved to Colorado, and the woman who did it for me wouldn't even tell me everything that she saw. She just said it was a whole parade of really terrible ways that I was murdered for stepping out and speaking the truth. And so I feel like, there was real ways that was stuck in the cells of my body, a form of cellular memory of that happening and not wanting that to happen again. And so I had to confront my own fears about the possibility of that happening to me, even though I knew on some level, that was probably not that realistic of a fear. So nevertheless, MLK fulfilled his life mission and became a hero to people all over the world. And so, how did he combat his own fears and insecurities? And what can we learn from his example? So some of the things that made him special as a leader, first of all, he had a clear vision. And so MLK's vision really represented the aspirations of millions of people. So his I Have a Dream speech was not his dream alone. And so he really did tap into a universal message in what he was bringing to people. And because he was tapping into a universal message, then he had a strong sense of moral conviction around that. So he was not just trying to make a name for himself or to make things better for his tiny group. He really did want to transform the entire world for the betterment of everyone, and to really, similar to Nelson Mandela, to really inspire all people to rise up into their highest potential. Something that I identify with a lot as well, kind of the message of, we can do better as a people. He received this message as well as the strength to bring it out into the world by being tapped into his connection to source. And so he was not just running on his own steam, and that's really, really important. He was really channeling a divine message, and therefore was given the soul strength to bring that forth, even under great adversity. And so in one of his memoirs, then he details about after receiving a threatening phone call at his home late in the evening, that it prompted a spiritual revelation that filled him with the strength to be able to carry on in spite of the persecution that he was experiencing. And finally, I'm just very struck, no doubt as a result of all of these things that I've been talking about. He really did have a strong sense of his own dignity and humanity. And he really knew his inherent worth as a person. And this came from his religious faith as well as from his upbringing. And so he was not somebody who was plagued by a lot of feelings of unworthiness. So he described about his mom that she taught him that he should feel a sense of somebodyness. And so she told him that, he would have to face a system that would stare him in the face every day and tell him that he was less than and not equal to. But she made it clear that she opposed this system, and she told him that you must never allow it to make you feel inferior. And she reminded him constantly that you are as good as anyone. And so interestingly, he reports that the first time that he was seated behind a curtain in a segregated dining car on a train, he described it that he felt as though a curtain had been dropped on his selfhood. So he says, I could never adjust to the separate waiting rooms, separate eating places, and separate restrooms, partly because the separate was always unequal, and partly because the very idea of separation did something to my sense of dignity and self-respect. And so this sense of dignity and self-respect, to me, is probably one of the most striking things about MLK as a person. So if you watch his speeches, it's just so evident in his body language, in the way that he speaks, and the way that he carries himself, that he's very poised, he's very still, he's very powerful, very fearless, and overall very present. You feel like his whole self is really there in the way that he speaks and the way that he carries himself. And I believe that it is this inherent sense of worth and the accompanying sense of self-respect and dignity that is also what most upset people about him, in particular white people, because it was a kind of insubordination. He didn't carry himself like an oppressed person. And I think that that's really interesting. And one of the things that I have noticed in the responses, the negative responses to my ad for this group, as I have sought to fill the place where all the negative comments and the nonsense were happening with my own voice and my own videos, and speaking from my own sense of knowledge and from my own sense of authority and from my own sense of vision, which is not just a vision for my little group, but really is a vision of what trans people, gender creative people, intersex, genderqueer, non-binary people are here to teach all of us who are here to teach humanity what we know based on our life experience as people largely standing outside of the gender binary. And it has been very interesting to see the result. And so one result is there's not so many comments. And so I do feel like my stepping out and putting a stop to that has really shut down some of that nonsense to begin with. People don't feel the same sense of permission to be able to just stand up and say ridiculous things, for instance. But also that people's comments have largely gotten a lot more aggressive and violent and a lot more personal attacks. And so a lot of them have been addressed, you know, Sam Bullington, you know, you are a fucking idiot and, you know, you should go off and die, basically. And so I think part of that response, the increased aggressiveness, has really come from, you know, the sense of insubordination that, you know, I'm not standing there pleading for cisgender people to tolerate me. You know, I'm really speaking from a place of authority and really speaking the truth about the nature of gender and our biology. And my next video especially is going to be about the dysfunction of cisgender heterosexuality and the healthiness of gender creative people to combat this notion that being trans is a mental illness, and so therefore gender creative people should not be leaders in society, but to really demonstrate what we know. And so I really feel like, you know, this really upsets the sense of power that cisgender people tend to feel, that they, you know, want to feel in that position of like, you know, trans people are ridiculous objects of pity. And so therefore I have power over them as a cisgender person and I can exert myself as a bully. And so to not, you know, fight back in traditional ways, but just to really to stand in your own sense of authority and dignity, I feel like is quite powerful. And it really does tend to ruffle people's feathers. You know, when you dare to speak out of your place, to speak with authority, not apology, and to really embrace your own humanity. And so, you know, how is your sense of dignity and self-respect? We've been talking a lot in here about the things that can compromise that. And where does that sense of dignity and self-respect come from? And so are you tapped into source, or are you trying to run on your own steam? And that, you know, what source means to you and how you access that is entirely up to you. But we really can't get very far when we're just trying to run on our own steam. And of course, you know, from the stories people have posted, as well as, you know, what I know about gender creative people's lives, you know, most of us did not receive that sense of somebodyness and inherent worth from our own families. And in fact, for many of us, that is where the greatest damage was done. And so what that means now as adults, you know, is not that, oh, we're just fundamentally damaged and we have to limp along in life, but that we really are tasked with healing that and with clearing up our energetic vibration, which is really necessary, not only for us to step into our most powerful place as leaders, but also to really be able to have happy and joyful and peaceful lives. And so ultimately, you know, what strikes me most about MLK is that he was in total vibrational alignment with his mission, with his message, and with his own sense of worth. And it is scary to step out there if you are not in vibrational alignment, because people can sense that you are an easy target and will feel your vulnerability and you know, the ways that you expect to not be treated very well, and will treat you in that manner. And so it's really important to clean that up. And there are ways to heal that and to clean up your energetic vibration. And that is really where I can help. And so if you recognize this as something that is holding you back, then let's have a conversation. So, you know, MLK was really able to speak for those who didn't have the vision or the words or the articulateness to be able to speak it, as well as, you know, those who maybe did have the vision, but didn't have the courage or the soul strength to be able to step out into the spotlight, to be able to receive the glory, as well as to absorb the wrath that goes with stepping out like that. And so I believe that, you know, those of you who have been called to this group are those who are called to step out and to speak for the others who can't. And so whenever you are ready to be that leader, then reach out and I can help you get there. So welcome to David and to Chelsea. It's great to have you here celebrating this MLK Day together. So if either of you have questions or comments, go ahead and post those now. I can address them. It looks like Brittany maybe is also here. And otherwise, I will be doing my next video in response to the ad about addressing this issue of trans people having a mental illness and so therefore not being equipped to be leaders in society because we can't even figure out our own gender. Ha ha ha. So I will be doing my video to address that tomorrow. And then there'll be one more after that, which will address, you know, is being trans against God and is being trans about sexuality, because some people have said, you know, why is this in my family-friendly feed? Because talking about trans issues is fundamentally talking about sex. And so there'll be two more videos that will address those. One will happen tomorrow and one will happen later in the week. And then we'll have another video, especially for this group and in some of the struggles and challenges that people are going through in this group. So thanks for being here. I hope you enjoy the rest of the MLK Day celebration. And I look forward to checking in with you again tomorrow.